That's Linglestown. Linglestown Road, if you recognize it, curves, and this is the farm that I'm talking about. Historically, the farm, currently it's 93 acres. Historically, it had been 201 acres. It came across like this, went down, out, and around. But I wanted to start talking about this because I'm going to go back to around 1550, so I can trace this back pretty far. So just give me 5 minutes. Let me review a little bit of U.S. history so everybody understands. You never did well in history class. But I'm going to go back to about 1550 of this area. In 1623 is when the Dutch first erected a fort on the Delaware River. Now that's 70 years after I'm going to start here, to give you a reference point. In 1664, King Charles II, the English, threw the Dutch out, took over, and in 1674, all the Dutch claims were given to England. Now, William Penn, everybody's heard about William Penn. Well, William Penn's father was owed a huge amount of money by the King of England. Didn't have the money. So William Penn's father was given the land that we may now talk about. That's Pennsylvania, includes Delaware and some overlapped areas. And that was in 1681. Now, Pennsylvania, we all understand Penn, and then Sylvania is Latin, that means woodland. Penn's woodland, not Penn's woods, but Penn's woodland. And in 1682, William Penn first divided up Pennsylvania into 3 counties: Chester, Philadelphia, and Bucks. So in 1682, everybody in this area, we were in Chester County. I don't know if you ever knew that. In 1684, 2 years later, William Penn started selling huge manors of Pennsylvania. Wanted some money, wanted to get what his dad was owed. Well, in 1698, the Shawnee Indians settled along the Susquehanna River. Now, you've heard of the Susquehannocks. They were a small tribe, and I have a slide that will come up, that really didn't have their own identity, but they were made up of stragglers, it appears, from a lot of the other tribes. It was almost like no one wanted them, so let's form our own. But in 1703, William Penn separated Delaware off. Now, here's the critical date. In 1718, almost 300 years ago, William Penn dies. His kids, grandkids take over, and they go, we're going to start selling this land, we're going to lease it, we're going to charge rent. In 1718, from Ireland, let me get the next slide. In 1718, the Irish had a mass exodus. That's Ireland. I hope people understand the geography. Most of the people in this area came from Oyster, and they left because of religious persecution, death, minor things. I'll leave this up for a second, but that's 1905. That is the front picture of the running pump farm. I had this digitally enhanced, enlarged, and Bill, I believe we enlarged that. I think that's could be B.F. Moyer. And there's a little old lady there, and then there's some old guy, I don't know who he is, in the stables. But bringing you up to history, in 1718 was the huge first migration out of Ireland. In 725, the second very large migration out of Ireland to United States. They came up to Chesapeake, they came to Philadelphia, and many of them came to our area here to settle. And the initial squatters, not settlers, but the initial squatters on the Running Pump Farm was Joseph Berryhill, his brother Andrew. There were 4 brothers and all their families. They left their parents in Ireland who died. And the family took off, came to the United States, and they settled on this farm. But you have to remember, the Indians laid claim that the king owned it, but William Penn and John Penn legally had title from the English. So it's a mixed bag. We do have the land grant given and signed by John Penn to Andrew Berryhill. We also have, it's in the Hershey Museum on parchment, the original land grant signed by the King of England with his wax seal. The Hershey Museum had it. Really cool, and I'll show you that. But I think it's important people just have a little idea of some of the history. To give a reference now, John Harris Jr., who was the founder of Harrisburg, was born in 1727. So we're talking about early from an American history standpoint. Now, in 1729, Lancaster County was first established. So in 1729, this farm, and I also refer to this farm including all of Lower Paxton, this whole region, was now in Lancaster County. Well, if you've moved, changed. In 1751, the Lancaster County records state, in Lancaster County there were 500 homes with white settlers, and all of Pennsylvania had 190,000 souls. But they also state, which does not include the pagan inhabitants. They were talking about the Indians. So a lot of what I may say may refer to the white people. These are historical facts. I'm not being racist at all. But Fort Hunter was established in 1755. Now, why is that important? If you look at this picture from 1905, you see this stone wall? Well, when I bought the farm in 2003, that stone wall was right up against Linglestown Road. So Linglestown Road currently today is right here. Give you an idea. And I'll get back to that, but just to put it in some reference. When I bought the farm in 2003, this house was existing. It was tumbling down, but it was existing. Everything else of it was gone. Also, historically, this building had been referred to as Fort Berryhill. Now, you'll hear a lot of names of forts. Fort Berryhill, Fort Gilchrist, Fort Hunter. There were provincial forts, and then there were what I call settlers' forts. The settlers' forts were nothing, well, look at it, that's not much of a fort. It was really nothing more than a fortified building with a couple gun slots. Most of the time, they didn't fight for these buildings, they hid in them. And when Andrew Berryhill was killed and scalped behind here, his family hid in there, and I have the death records as well, so it's pretty neat. But Fort Hunter was a provincial fort. Provincial meaning the British paid for it. The British many times staffed it, or they paid settlers to staff it. And in reading letters from Benjamin Franklin, who amazingly was very involved in what's going on here back then, the biggest problem they had was all the settlers' protectors were drunks. They'd shoot each other, so they had more deaths from each other than they did from Indians. So time-wise, there's also a Fort Spatera, which is towards Lebanon, and that was a provincial fort. That was 1757. Anyway, in let me get into now in 1725. That's the nearest date that I can actually document. This farmland was squatted upon, not settled, but they just got there and said, okay, we're going to build a house, we're going to plant crops. I do have documents that claim or state that this land had no trees at all. It was barren field back in those days. So there are some forests with trees now, but back then this was barren land. And in 1725 is about the earliest I can establish that the squatters arrived, which was Joseph Berryhill. As far as the Indians, we're around here, to give you an idea. So the Indian groups that lived in the valley were surrounded by the following, Shawnee, Iroquois. And interesting enough is the Shawnee, who were a strong tribe, were documented many times for coming into the valley. And of the Berryhill brothers, 3 of them were killed by Indians. 2 of them I have it documented, at least in documents. Now, I think David said one thing to learn about history is you don't know, it lies. I can only tell you what I read, and I've read a lot of documents. This is John Penn, 1681. This is not William Penn, but this is his grandson. That's the only picture that I could find of him, and that, of course, is the settlers. When the Irish, and they were Scotch-Irish, they left Ireland in 1718 and 1725, 3/4 of them sailed into the Chesapeake, up to Philadelphia, and then they settled where we are. And many a times they continue down south. The first settler of, let's get to the meat of the matter, the first settler of the Running Pump Farm was Joseph Berryhill and his wife Hannah. Now Joseph stayed on Running Pump Farm for a number of years with all his brothers, but over the years, and I'll give you the dates, the other Berryhill brothers were killed by Indians during the Indian Wars. Joseph Berryhill ultimately traveled further south and died in North Carolina. And I read his will, and I'll tell you some interesting points of the will, which it's just very interesting fodder, if you will. He died in 1781. And back then, for example, he willed his wife Hannah his Negro wench doll. You know, these are things that you can't comprehend, and you have to also understand, in our area, there was slavery back in that period of time. Matter of fact, in the Wenrick Church, which we'll get to, which is the next owner, there are slaves buried there, but they're buried outside the wall of the cemetery. They are there. You'll also notice, as I'm going down now, the historical owners of the Running Pump Farm, 95% of them are all buried in Wenrick Cemetery, which is interesting. They just never went far. So Andrew Berryhill Sr. had 4 sons. He and his brother originally squatted and built what became known as Running Pump Farm. This was the Running Pump Tavern, and they also called that Fort Berryhill, obviously named after the founder. Now the picture I showed you earlier is actually this building. This part was torn out in 1880, and I'll discuss that. But in 1756, Andrew Berryhill Sr., that was one of the original squatters, not settlers yet, they had no legal right of ownership. Andrew Berryhill Sr., November 15th, 1755, because we found his death record. you can actually go, and I was floored. You can actually go, in this case, remember it was in Chester County. In this time period, the farm was in Lancaster County. They had the death record and the newspaper. Andrew Berryhill was killed and scalped there. So we know the day. Our records are good now, but the records back then were actually pretty good. In 1860, his other brother Samuel was killed and scalped by Indians. And the records noted Samuel's wife Martha escaped from the Indians by swimming across the Susquehanna River during the high stage. He was killed by Fort Hunter. Now, if you know Linglestown Road, which is right out front, but back in this time period, it was called Fort Hunter Road. That was the main Indian travel, Conestoga wagon. That was the wagon train, east to west. And they usually would travel from fort to fort. So they would go, if you notice and look at the old fort locations on maps, between each fort, theoretically, was about a day's travel. So if a local settler got into trouble, and trouble was usually, well, either drunk trouble or Indian trouble, they could go to a fort, but at least they could get there by nightfall. That was the theory behind it. So the father of Andrew Berryhill Jr., who initially got the land grant, he was killed in 1756. His uncle then was killed in 1760. And William Berryhill, I forgot about him, but he was the other brother. He was killed in 1755. And he also was killed by Indians and scalped. Now, I'll throw something out just time-wise. 1762, anybody hear about the Paxton Boys? As a result of all these Indian killings, and some of them happened on the Running Pump Farm, the Paxton Boys, and I don't want to mischaracterize, but what I've read is they were a bunch of guys who got drunk and just basically wiped out the Susquehanna Indians who were remaining. Well, they called, there were Susquehanna Indians, but they also called them the Conestoga Indians, and then the wagon was named after the Indian tribe, not the other way around, actually. So, but in 1765, I think I have that next. This, 1756, I'm sorry. This was the original land grant issued by John Penn, and then he had his Surveyor General, and that is what gave Andrew Berryhill Jr. I have to preface that by saying they did not use senior and junior back then. Everybody in every generation was called either William, Samuel, Andrew, so I really had to kind of figure this out. So I'm calling him Junior. And interesting, in the 1780 and 85 tax assessments, it also notes, because they look, every government wants their taxes. They did very good census reports even back then, tax assessments. But back then you were taxed on the land, the structures, and your slaves. And so the tax assessments, the assessment rolls would say free white men, free white women, and then, you know, enslaved people. So from Andrew Berryhill Jr., I should say, while Andrew Berryhill Jr. owned the farm, that is, by the way, from the Hershey Museum, on parchment, and that is the King of England. You know, they had the ranges, like the movies, they drip wax. That is the land on the parchment from the king. And in this case, you can see Andrew Berryhill. Even though that does say senior, I think it says, but senior was dead. In the land grant, it granted the land to Andrew Berryhill Jr., but it noted in there that he settled there and his father was killed by Indians. To be a first grantor, first landowner, you had to have an attachment or an investment into the land. You couldn't just call the king up or text the king and say, I want some land. You have to be living there, you had to farm it. In this case, his father died protecting it. Those were some of the criteria. The John Penn and the Penn family, they taxed people. That's why they wanted all these settlers. That was their revenue. The Berryhill generations died out. There's something interesting that I found in the chain of title on the Running Pump Farm. And my family is only the 5th family in 300 years to own the farm. The farm originally was owned, as I said, by Joseph Berryhill, then it went to Andrew Sr., Andrew Jr. So it typically would be passed down through the generations. And in 1784, this gentleman purchased the farm, not related to the Berryhills. He bought the farm. Do you know where that expression comes from? World War II, when someone would get killed in action, they'd get some money from the government, enough to pay off the farm, and that expression was he bought the farm. That's where that expression comes from. Nothing to do with this. This is Franz Weinrich. He's been called Francis. He has a heck of a pompadour going on. But when he purchased the Running Pump Farm, and he purchased it in 1784, he was the one that named it the Running Pump Farm. And he purchased it in 1784. He was the one that named it the Running Pump Farm. The Running Pump Tavern was built in 1741 by the Berryhill family. They called it Mount Hill. Now I know the restaurant at Linglestown and Colonial, that's called Mount Hill. But I believe Berryhill had ownership of that also at one point. That was Mount Hill. After the Running Pump Farm was Mount Hill. Franz Weinrich bought the farm in 1784. What existed on the farm was a Running Pump Tavern. It was also called the Running Pump Hotel. It was a stopover point for all the travelers going east-west down the trail. But back then, the deed in 1784 said 201 acres. That's the earliest recorded land size that I could find. Now, when he ultimately sold the farm in 1825, after his death, the farm had been cut down to 134 acres. He donated land to Weinrich Cemetery, Weinrich Church. He did sell 60-some acres to a man that I cannot find any historical reference to, and I'm going to throw it out there, Aaron Kreiser, if anybody has heard of that name. Now, interesting, Franz Weinrich's wife's maiden name was Krieger with a G. And I'm guessing maybe that's her brother, a relative. It could be, it's a guess. I can't find any reference to him though. And he passed away, and they sold the farm in 1825. Now in 1825, a fellow by the name of Henry Miese, that's Weinrich's church. That is, I don't expect you to read it because I couldn't read it with a magnifying glass. But a lot of the reference materials that I've been getting, I get from the wills. And it's tough to read. Many of websites I've found actually have people, I guess, had nothing else to do, but they will read the old documents and type them so you can access it, and it's super. It's really helpful. Henry Miese and his wife Elizabeth purchased the farm in 1825. So this is the third family. all these years down on the farm. And in 1836, Henry Miese's son Joseph built a small house on the farm. This is the old 1875 map many people look at. Here's the farm. You'll see on the map, it says J. Miese. This is Linglestown. Now, we walked with a bunch of people, with Bob Thomas. I don't know if anybody is familiar with the old, well, actually, right there is the stock certificate. Right behind, in the back of my farm, is, you can see where they were hand digging in the railroad. I understand they had like hundreds of Chinese workers hand digging all that. It's still there, you can walk it. I never knew that. And of course, this is the map of Lower Paxton. On the Miese farm, now back then, people were religious, they gave, they donated. In 1880, they built the Mount Zion School on the Running Pump farm. And I saw where they actually leased it. See, so I can do leasing on my farm. They've been doing that for a long time. The farm, the building here when it was built, I saw records cost $727 to build the whole thing, and furnish it, and put blackboards in there, and everything else ready, and the books to open. Now, in 1850, there's a note in one of the deeds, and I found this note, and I'll read it word for word. It's just east of the Running Pump Tavern. Let's get settled. Here we are. This is Linglestown Road. If you look at the entrance to the farm, it's right here. That's gone, of course, and I'll tell you a little history about it. This was the Running Pump Tavern. In 1850, Joseph Miese, the son of the owner, built this little cottage for his parents. And there's a note in the deed that says, and it didn't specify, even though I think it's right here. Davey asked me where to dig. But it says, Joseph Miese came upon a cave with bones of several humans. Not knowing if these bones were from Indians or white men, Joseph closed up the cave. So if you want to go metal detecting and knock yourself out, but that's right in this area. And Linglestown Road currently runs right where the fence is. In 1851 was the school that I showed you. But what's also interesting is in the early 1800s, the Mieses, and this is where the name Running Pump Tavern came from. There's a stream right here, and it goes across what's now Linglestown Road. They took 36-foot logs that were 18 inches in diameter. They burned holes through them. They put the logs in the stream under the trail, which is now Linglestown Road, and they piped water into the tavern, hence the name Running Pump Tavern. This was one of the first structures to have indoor plumbing. I don't know if they had a urinal, but they had indoor plumbing. In 1860, give you again a time frame, the original picture had this building for Running Pump Tavern, which is also Fort Berryhill. But it had a second, which was a kitchen attached to it. In 1860, Joseph Miese, the son of the current owner, back in 1825, took the kitchen down, demolished it without a permit. He took it down. All the stonework for from the kitchen that he took down is right here. And it was also the stonework for the foundation of the house that was built in 1880. Now, I think Nevin Moyer, I saw a note, was born in that house. Oh, yes. And we'll get to him. So all of this and the foundation wall was on that building, was actually part of the Running Pump Tavern. Now, the Miese family owned the property 1825 to 1873, and then in 1873, Joseph Miese, the son, took title. One thing I also noticed in the late 1800s that the owners had multiple wives, different times. But, you know, I thought back then you married your wife kind of forever. No, they divorced them. And that was, I found that very interesting. In 1873, Joseph Miese redid the piping. I guess he modernized it and made bigger piping, longer piping. In 1879, the Locust Hill School was closed, and the new school, which I showed you was Mount Zion School, was put up. Now, in 1880 to 1883, a fellow by the name of Jesse Lanker owned the farm. But he also married into the Miese family. I don't know if you've ever heard. I had to really figure out who he was. Because Bill's from the Miese family, sort of. Now, moving forward, in 1883, B.F. Moyer, that's a name you hear quite often, Benjamin F. Moyer, got a hold of the farm. In 1908, this barn, not this one, but this one. This is a 1905 photo. In 1908, this barn was hit by lightning, burned to the ground, and then they rebuilt. However, that's not the original barn. There was an earlier barn, and I found, I'll find the date. There was an earlier barn that was torched. They arrested a man by the name of Joseph Poorman, who hired two people, and they torched the first barn. And they rebuilt it. And in 1908, this was hit by lightning, burned to the ground, and they again rebuilt it. Now, at this time period, this farm was 134 acres. Now, in 1910, B.F. Moyer died, and the farm went to his children, Nevin Moyer and Irene, Nevin's sister. Nevin, I'm sure most people have heard about Nevin Moyer. Now, Nevin Moyer had been born in this house. From 1910 to 1932, Nevin and his sister Irene, whose married name was Unger, and that's a very popular old name in this area as well. And in 1932, an executor for 30 days had ownership. And back then, there were people who, I don't know if they didn't probate things like today, but an executor took possession, they figured out who would own it, and then they transferred it. So the executor, named Ezra Kerr, had ownership for 30 days. But then in 1932 to 1952, Nevin Moyer and his wife Sarah owned the farm. Now, while Nevin owned the farm, he sold off a few pieces here and there of the farm. This, in 1913, by the way, Running Pump Tavern, this picture is from 1913. In 1913, the tavern was knocked down. It was falling down, but they took it down. You can't read it, but we can surely get copies for you. But there was a big article and write-up that the local papers did. Now, on this side of the Running Pump Tavern was where their outdoor kitchen originally was. And that's what was taken down to help build the stone wall and the house. Now, ultimately, Nevin Moyer sold the farm. If you notice, this is his ad. He advertised it as 84 acres, and he was dead on. As I found out years later after I bought it, we we could only find 84 acres. And well, now we know it's probably true. Look at his phone number, though. It's kind of not much. This is an aerial photo. Nearest we can figure was around 1950. We're trying to date the cars and so forth. If you notice, here's Linglestown Road. You notice it's right up against this stone. In the earlier 1905 picture, well, it wasn't called Linglestown Road, but it was way down here. It was at one point Market Street. This was the house built in 1880 that Nevin Moyer was born in.
Eric, that's 1863. Yeah.
You're right. You're 1862 because the cornerstone.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Stone
You are
side of the
correct.
house.
Correct. The Running Pump Tavern. Look, history isn't always right, and neither am I. So yeah, please correct.
I know there was an actual stone up on the top in between those two windows that gave the actual. We're the daughters, so you can see it.
Yeah, this was where the Running Pump Tavern was. This was at one point that I called mother-in-law's kind of house. Then of course there was small barns, equipment sheds, you know, the typical thing you find on a farm. I actually read a document when Andrew Berryhill was killed, which was 1756, when his wife and his son ran to what was Running Pump Tavern. Apparently they had a stairwell on the first floor that went up to a loft. Underneath that stairwell in the floor was a hidden panel that they could drop down below and seal themselves in. So it wasn't a fort where they fought from, like the movies, you know, John Wayne stuff here. They literally just went down and they simply hid until the coast was clear. And the Oyster family purchased the farm in 1952. As they passed, it went to their son, Charles, and Dottie Oyster. Dottie still lives in the house right at the end of the farm. And then in 2003, I had purchased the farm. To give you an interesting fact, this survey was performed by Nevin, or ordered by Nevin Moyer. He hired a surveyor. But my point, what's interesting, this is what we call now Linglestown Road. But if you notice, it says Market Street, which was before that Fort Hunter Road. But if you notice, currently, Linglestown Road comes up this way and then kind of hooks. When Nevin had the farm, he subdivided a couple pieces off. A little bit here, a little bit up here is at the Rescue Drive, and there's a couple of houses up there. That was chopped off the farm. And interesting, I bought a piece of ground about 6-7 years ago that's right here that brought the farm back to one piece. It had been over the years chopped apart and different people had owned it. And over here was the 65 acres that Wenrick had sold to Mr. Kreiser, which I think turns out to be, is that a black church from Philadelphia now?
Masonic, black on the other side of the North Park.
Correct, and they've owned it since 1905. Does everybody know what I'm talking about? You come down, there's a parkway, and then there's a big open 65 acres there that was not sold. I think it was donated. They had some schools there primarily for black orphanage. They still own it. It's just vacant. It's been vacant since many, many years. But during the war times, and wartime, I don't know about Revolutionary War, minor, but definitely Civil War. They used the fields as a parade grounds, marching grounds, practice, the soldiers came. Now, topography-wise, this area is very flat back here. Then there's a bump in the middle and another bump rise. So I'm only guessing, but this area is quite huge. It's flat, and it may not be a bad idea to, metal detector sometime.
Yeah, we started that.
It's a lot of walking, but
Tavern had his troop out there too, training prior to World War I. The governor's troop used the grounds.
this area also was at one point part of the farm. It was chopped off, the road was brought there, and I think there were 3 or 4 houses built. What was really common, and still is for farmers, when you need some money, you take some land, chop it into a couple of house lands, and you can buy a new tractor. I mean, that's typically, over the years, what would happen. But the primary buildings on this entire farmstead has always been in this general area here. And this, of course, was the Running Pump Tavern, the little in-law suite. There was a big barn here when, around 2001, I think it was taken down, and the Amish removed it. It's in Lancaster somewhere right now.
West Virginia.
Is it West Virginia?
They had barn builders come to take it down and move it to West Virginia. It's a horse farm.
Is it? Yes, sir.
Had there ever been a running pump post office prior to the Civil War, so that someone that hailed from that area could have been given credit as having come from running pump?
I've never seen a reference, but I've seen references to the Linglestown post office.
Okay.
Prior to the Civil War, Daniel Moyer had a store in Linglestown, and he had the post office. But at that point in time, his grandson was Benjamin Franklin Moyer, B.F. Moyer. He was not married yet, so they weren't on the farm. But Daniel Moyer had a farm, and he did have a post office. He was the postmaster in the...
Now, if someone sent a letter to, Running Pump Hotel, because it was also called the Running Pump Hotel, it put up many of the settlers passing through.
Well, I know there's a running pump in Lancaster County also.
Oh, I don't doubt when I Google Running Pump, they're like all over the place.
But when they claim that the Gorgas family of Panama Canal fame came from running pump, have you ever found anything to substantiate that?
No, but actually, Jim I was talking to, Jim has a Civil War store in Mechanicsburg, and he's pretty much, I've known Jim like 40 years, an expert. Jim has information, and he was sharing with me today, and I'm going to follow up. Yes, Jim, go ahead.
Several sites say Running Pump, Dauphin County, that he was born. Some say Running Pump, Lancaster. And that's what we're trying to figure out.
You have to remember, Lancaster was here.
Yeah, but he was born after Dauphin County. He's 1818. Lancaster broke off Dauphin broke off 1785.
Right.
Okay? But I've had retired Army colonels say that Gorgas was born at the Running Pump farm. What I'm thinking, do people stay in the inn or tavern for a while? Was he maybe born at the tavern, but he's not from?
Could have been,
See what I
because
mean?
there are many references I've found where it called it the Running Pump Hotel. So
Right.
that could be.
That's what I'm trying to, because, like Bill was talking about, Gorgas later became head of Confederate ordnance. Guy from Pennsylvania, because his wife,
Confederate?
his wife's dad was governor of Alabama, so he's down there. But he's head of Confederate ordnance, but he was born in some sites, say, Running Pump, Dauphin County.
It's interesting. I have to come to your store.
Yeah.
Because I've ordered many books, and we've gone to museums, documents. You also have to remember there's conflicts. Most of history was written down, the word of mouth, and tweaked and turned. And it is a filtering process. But I am following up on that when Jim and I were talking about that earlier tonight.
Jim, there's a possibility of Henry Miese and Joseph Miese hired people who worked the farm.
Yep.
There is a book over at the Hershey Museum that has their accounts of who they paid, how much they paid an hour. I have access to that. And before you leave, give me the exact spelling of the name. We can check. It's possible they may have been sharecroppers or worked on the farm.
Gorgas was a big name around here. I collect postcards, late 1800s, and there's a Gorgas drugstore in Harrisburg. There's Gorgas is a mechanics firm that started a lot of business and companies.
Yeah, it's
They're
very-
really prominent in this area.
Yeah, it's very possible that he could have been living on the farm at that time.
Any other, yes?
Yeah.
Farm and farmers, just for their consumption or selling it?
Well, a little bit of both. Back in the day, in the 1700s, you also have to remember their production was all by hand. So most of it was either personal consumption, even on the Berryhills, there was 4 families, that came here. So they consumed a lot, but they were also trading. There was a lot, because you have to put into context the money. There wasn't U.S. currency, matter of fact, there was no U.S. So what was the trade was beaver pelts or something you produced on your farm, whether it be timber, vegetables. They grew hay a lot on this farm, which we still do after 300 years. But I know Nevin Moyer, for example, Nevin didn't farm at all. Nevin hired a commercial farmer like I have today.
Both the Miese family and the Moyer family, Benjamin, they all had grain and stuff they sold. I've seen the accounts of the money they've taken in, how much they made a bushel, and they did sell their product. There were quite a few mills in our area that did mill the grain.
And their occupation and all the census data back to Mises, the Moyers, were all farmers. That was their sole occupation. So back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, of course they were producing to sell, to bring to market. But at that point too, we're much more populated than the original settlers. Anybody else? Well, thank you.